Okay, good morning, or depending upon where in the world you are, good afternoon or good evening. I'm Lisa Berkeley, and this is Reaction to Response webinar series. Before I go through all of our introductions, I'm going to just put up on the screen information about our after party, where if you're participating live, you can join us afterwards. So I'm going to just switch to that, and hold on, and there we go. You should be able to see that. Oops. And there. Back one. Sorry about that. Okay. And what you're seeing now, as I said, is the information for our after party. There's a URL and phone number that you can join us from.
Lisa, we're not seeing that quite yet.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Okay. Hold on. Sorry about that. We are having some technical issues already. There we go. Okay. One more second. Thank you, Sandy, for who's behind the screens with us. Okay. Are you seeing that now?
Yep.
Yes.
Right on. Okay. Anyway, good morning again, everyone. So before we begin, I'd like to just go over a couple of quick housekeeping points. If you're inspired to ask any questions during the call, you can put your question in the chat section where there is also the information about the after party as well. Or if you just hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen, there's a space for question and answers that will pop up. Also, so you are aware, this call is being recorded. Reaction to Response is a twice-a-month, year-long series birthed through the Charter of Compassion Women and Girls sector, and it was birthed out of the recognition that we're living in chaotic times that has caused many people to react from a place of fear rather than take a breath and respond from a place of care and compassion. And so that was what was the motivation for this series. In addition, we have wanted to support the goals of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to switch now and put on the screen the goals that we are supporting during our call with our guest, Michael Kasdan. Of the UN goals, there are 17, 8 of which will be addressed during this call. Some very directly, others a little bit more indirectly. And before we go into our call, I just want to take a minute and thank Sandy Hart and Susan DeGaia, Brianna Lathorpe, and Betsy Spano for working with us behind the scenes. What else can I tell you? I think that's about it. And I will say one more thing, though. This call may be a bit provocative, and it may touch places in your heart and soul that we'd like you to sit with and explore and go deeper with. And so now I'm going to stop sharing my screen and say good morning and welcome to Michael Kasdan, who is the director of the special projects for the Good Men Project. You can find out more about them on thegoodmenproject.org. Oh, sorry, it's goodmenproject.org. And sorry?
.com. Yeah.
Oh, .com. Sorry. Thank you. Or, of course, you can go to charterforcompassion.org. And I'm sure by now you've already read about Michael. And so without further ado, let's switch to our conversation. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so happy you're here. So in our pre-call, one of the first things that I asked is to get a sense of how you got into this topic of the role that men play in feminism and the evolution that men are going through in today's chaotic world. How did you get into developing your feminine side and all of that?
Yeah. So for me, these actually weren't issues that I spent a lot of time thinking about until recently, until I got involved with the Good Men Project, I guess about 4 years ago now. And my entry point into the Good Men Project actually, wasn't directly in terms of dealing with gender issues or feminism. It was actually through mental health. I was at a point in my life where I'd really struggled with depression, which was a massive shock to me. I was 35 years old, and it was I didn't really believe it was a thing until it was a very real thing in my life. And I wrote about it, I wrote about that experience just because I thought it would be cathartic to do. And I shared that with some friends of mine. And one of my friends was connected to the Good Men Project. She knew some people over there, and said, you really should publish this, because it's something that a lot of people and a lot of men go through, and it could help them to see that piece of writing and what you went through, and know that there are other people out there going through the same thing. And my first thought was, there's absolutely no way in hell that I'm going to actually publish this thing. It's too shameful. What if someone from work saw it? And so at that point I talked to an editor at the Good Men Project named Mark Green, and he published it anonymously for me at the time. And I was introduced to Mark, and through him, I was introduced to Lisa Hickey, who's the CEO and publisher of the Good Men Project. Surprise, it's a woman. And I met her, and we started talking. At the time, I was, and still am, a dad. I was coaching Little League, and I was, playing pickup basketball and talking about kind of those male friendships. And I've always been a sports guy. And she said, we really need someone to write some sports content for us, not like ESPN or watching highlights or box scores, but more, using sports as a way to talk about social issues. So we wrote, I wrote articles talking about bullying and talking about, the NFL and the problem with head injuries and what that says sort of culturally about masculinity. So it was a way to start to get at those issues. And just through that process, I met a whole community of people that had spent a lot of time and very talented and passionate talking about issues, gender issues, feminism, sexism, racism, social justice. And so that was kind of my way in, I guess, through the back door. And that was about 4 years ago.
Wow. So, I mean, that's a big deal to go from talking about going public about your depression and mental illness, or not mental illness, but mental challenges. I mean, I don't know how you prefer to define it. Society has previously defined it one way.
Mental health is good.
Mental health, yeah. I think many people have gone through that journey, and as far as experiencing depression and struggling with what society defines as normal. And so first, I just want to take a second and thank you for your courage. It's a huge deal, especially as a man. And I wonder how that was for you. What did you learn about yourself and starting to speak about being so transparent about your feelings and emotions, which society has previously deemed unacceptable?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the common thread between that topic and, our topic of today is, a couple things. One, what society deems normal and becoming aware of that whole superstructure in our culture and our society, and that threads through so many issues, sexism and racism and stigma of mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just sort of one common thread that I saw. But for me, the real takeaway was which I think also threads through a lot of these issues, and is kind of one of my focuses in pushing for social change in the issues I care about, and that's the power of storytelling. I think I found that we're at a place in this country where everything seems so polarized, and it seems impossible to bridge gaps. And I found, through the Good Men Project, I think what we do really well is we tell stories. And I think through storytelling, personal stories about real people who are your friends or your neighbors or your fathers or daughters or sisters, I think through that is a really powerful potential for change. So yeah, it's been a process. I mean, on mental health, I know that's not our topic today, but for me, for me, I went through a process of being ashamed and scared to realizing how many people have the same feelings, and to being more public about it, to a point where, I've spoken about this issue, in presentations before, lawyers at sort of professional settings. That's my day job. So I've moved, and I lead a group at the Good Men Project, which is a weekly conversation about men's mental health issues. So I went from being very ashamed and alone, to learning sort of how powerful it is to share your story. We did a video where the hashtag we chose, which was not mine, but someone in our group came up with it, and I think it's great, is not weak, just human. And it's just, it's the way to build community and empathy. And I think the more open we are in having these difficult conversations, the better off we are, and the less alone we feel. And I think there's a real potential for change when you're actually having conversations. And sometimes they're really difficult to have, but often.
Right. Well, it's interesting. I mean, and the reason I sort of wanted to start off on talking about this, this part of your journey, and what it brings to the table, is because society so often defines, oh, if we actually express how we feel, then that means, oh, you're either, to your point, if you're a man, you're weak,
Right.
or you're just being too much like a girl, or you're being, some derogatory term related to women.
Right.
Um,
Oh, for
and
sure.
and it's really what I find so fascinating is the gap between making women less. When we make men less than, we also make the women less than. And as we evolve as humans and embrace all sides of ourselves, I think really what you're talking about too is, what does it mean to be a man? And how do you define that? And how do we shift the storytelling, shift the narratives? And I think certainly the work through Good Men Project has been a big piece of that.
Yeah.
You also mentioned once something about the mailbox. What is
Yeah.
the mailbox?
Yeah. So it's the term we used was the man box.
Man box. Okay, sorry. I got.
No, that's okay. I like mailbox, actually, but I think it's already taken. But yeah, I mean, like you said, and as we alluded to earlier, society has very strict rules for what it means uh, to be a man, to practice masculinity, and I think both genders deal with it. It's the same. In terms of what it means to be feminine, and this is not a term that I coined or that we coined. I'm not sure who started using it first, but I came to this term, the man box, through the Good Men Project and through the writings of my friend Mark Green, who I mentioned earlier, who's written a lot about this. And what the man box is the traditional, cultural view of masculinity, which is, what it means to be a, quote unquote, real man, right? So you have to like sports and beer and sex, and you have to be very, self-reliant and physically strong, not showing emotions, other than maybe anger and excitement. And it's very limiting. And what Mark Green writes a lot about, what I've written about, and what we've explored, and others who have studied this issue have found that our society has very strong sort of enforcement, policing of masculinity that starts at a very young age. People who have studied this this issue said it starts at age 4 and 5, where when we hear boys will be boys. But looking at masculinity through this prism, this sort of traditional masculinity as the only real masculinity, I think is very damaging to both men and women. So the ideals for masculinity, what we try and put forward at the Good Men Project, what I personally believe, is that we have to have a much more diverse understanding of what it means to be a man. And it doesn't necessarily mean that sort of Marlboro man ideal. And if we stick to that and make people stick people in that peg, when many people are not like that. It's very damaging. So the man box is one way into this discussion, both of masculinity, but and also of gender roles and femininity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's interesting. You're making me think a little bit more too about if, as we let go of breaking those stereotypes, what does that mean for the overarching societal way of being, and how does the society define itself too, right? Because, for example, here military is so strong, right?
Right.
And that's manly. And although we have a lot of women who are trying to get into that, still, it's very, very, um, masculine and being angry and aggressive. And actually, if we start to involve feelings of compassion and empathy, it changes our relationship between self and other. And so, does that, in your work, does that tie into it as far as how you view yourself and how you view your community? And do you see that affecting others in your community in the same way?
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting and difficult question. But yes, you mentioned. I think we see this in our culture. Like, stereotypes happen because I think one, in it's natural in a sense for humans to want to fit in and be part of the community. But I think there becomes a point when that can be really detrimental. You mentioned war. We talk about a lot about head injuries in football, where I mean men are like it's complicated. I'm a football fan, but I'm also really active locally in trying to get schools and education, because people are literally killing themselves. And so I think those very strict attitudes about force, about sex and sexuality, leads to things like the rape culture we have, sexism and catcalling. I think it all sort of flows from that, and it's very damaging to women. But our point is, it's very damaging to men, because it's very limiting. And so that's kind of where we're coming from.
So interesting. It really, this subject always touches my heart very deeply, because when we talk about human rights and when we talk about racism and we talk about sexism, it's when you repress one, you repress everyone. And it's a heartbreaking process, but that can also help to open the heart a little bit more and help us develop compassion for one another.
Yeah.
It's so I'm going to interrupt where I was about to go, because I see we have a question. So I want to be inclusive of everyone here who's participating. The question is, how is the issue of mental health and depression received by other men, and how does that, or did that, challenge the impact on how your masculinity was perceived?
So that's a great question, and I think there are certainly people who have that knee-jerk man up, just tough it out, stop being such a wimp. But I find those people were not people that I knew, and those people were not people that knew anyone who really went through that in any sort of strong way. So even though I found there was this, I felt this big stigma that prevented me in the beginning from talking about it, and which I had to sort of learn over time, like brick by brick, each person I talked to. And it happened because as I started to talk to more people, most reaction of men was like either, wow, I totally understand what you're going through, I'm so sorry, how can I help? Or I've gone through that exact thing, or I know someone who's gone through that exact thing. So it's interesting that the contrast between the expectation, that sort of what you think might happen, people just saying, oh, you're a wimp, suck it up, man up. But the actual real world reaction was quite the opposite, which and we took that and built a community with it, right? So we started this men's mental health group because there are a lot, because we were like, wow, there are a lot of people out there who, and we urge people to share their stories and form that community, because we can help each other, and together we can change the world.
Absolutely. It's so true. And that's the point too. The more we become transparent of all of our, what is the scratches, bumps, and warts, so to speak, the truth, which they're actually what make us beautiful. And then showing all our vulnerability, um, we find something really, one, the human experience that helps us embrace more of who we are, you
Yeah,
know.
it is hard to do, and I know I think about I'm a fan of like Kurt Vonnegut, and he talked about, I forget, it was like FOMO or Gramfluence. He had this made up word for ways that people associate themselves together in groups, right? And one of those ways you define yourself is, okay, well, I'm a man and I'm this way, and so I fit into this group, and I know if I go and I talk about football and it's a natural easy thing. And I think there's a real tension between kind of our individual selves and kind of those constructs. But I've really found that, like, the more I talk about that issue and all these other issues, whether it's politics or feminism, like, yes, there's very strong views on both sides, but there are a lot of people that share my experience and viewpoint, and it's a little bit like just sort of jumping off a cliff. Like, the fear of talking about these issues, because it is hard, is is can be paralyzing. But then I can say, having done it, um, it's the actual reality is really rewarding.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think that's that way about so many things. The fear of taking that step, and then doing it is so different. Once you're done it, you're like, oh, how could I not do it? And it also does feed off of itself more and more courage. I think, I can't remember. It's a French poet, I think, who says, you step off, come to the edge. It goes, come to the edge. This
Yeah,
very
yeah.
sweet poem, come to the edge. And then they say, we're afraid. And the voice gets louder, come to the edge. And they say, no, we can't, we're afraid. And finally they say, come to the edge and jump. And finally they do, and they learn to fly or something. I've paraphrased a very lovely, empowering story,
Yeah,
that is about that space of taking the courage to shift your reality and step out of the societal norms and the social structures. And that's such powerful and necessary work. Hold on one second, because there's another question coming in. It says, do you think silence is a silent killer that impedes the natural evolution of men? If so, how do you empower men to do what you have done, and as far as being able to speak up?
yeah. I mean, I think I talked a little bit about the man box and
Mhm.
kind of the standard way of performing masculinity. It is a bit isolating, right? When you talk about when I say that this limiting vision of masculinity hurts men and women, I mean, like, literally, like, we would be better off as a society with more women in the boardroom, and that's one issue that's sort of front and center politically, right? That the pay disparity and equality in that way. But in the same way, it hurts men because it's very isolating and it's very lonely. And so, I mean, yes, I think silence kind of fits into sort of the natural MO of depression. It just it complements each other. So I think, and it is hard to talk about these issues because it's perceived as not strong or flawed in some way. And I think it's hard to talk about all these issues. Like, we have conversations about racism, where, as a white person, to talk about institutional racism, it feels like you're admitting a flaw, and it's much it's much easier to say, like, no, everything's fine. And it's the same thing with sexism or rape culture. Like, it's uncomfortable to hear the results and the real stories of men doing horrible things. And so it's, you want to empower men to speak up. You don't want to shut down that conversation. And it's a really hard question as to how to do that. And the only way I know how to do that so far is to share more stories that show people do this. And I think those stories are a way in. I think it's very, you're not going to change people by saying either just man up, or hey, you really should just change the way you are. But if you can tell someone, like, hey, look at this story for this friend that's happened to you. They're a Black person and they got stopped 25 times by a police officer last year. Look at that, listen to that story. Or the same thing with issues of feminism or sexism. It's the only way I know how, because I've been in fights where people get angry, and these issues are very polarizing. And I think there is one sort of group of men that has a very negative knee-jerk reaction to feminism, because I think people feel like you're taking something away from me and you're always criticizing me. It's difficult, and I'm sure we'll get to all of it. But to me, the best way to empower men is for more of us men to share stories and to be accepted into that type of conversation. And I'm not saying we should accept racism or sexism. I think you have to have certain ground rules. But I think to have an open conversation where people are heard. I think a lot of times we're just not talking about these issues together. At the Good Men Project, some other men's groups are really men's groups. Like, they go away for a men's retreat together, and sometimes people are surprised that the CEO of the Good Men Project is a woman, and that roughly half our readership is men and women. It's about 50-50, and maybe similarly with writers. But our tagline is the conversation no one else is having, and I really believe there's absolutely a space for women to talk to women and for men to talk to men. But I think if we're trying to really change the world, it's not a conversation if we're just talking to ourselves.
Okay, so I was smiling because one of the things that I was very intrigued by was an article. Actually, we posted it on our Facebook page that you wrote about it. It was about the election and about Hillary, but more importantly, it was about gut feeling. And this article spun me on my head, I have to tell you, because and I just want to touch this very briefly, because there's a question from a man. I don't know if I should be mentioning people's names, so okay, he mentions his name, so I'll get there in a minute. From a man in Mexico City that I think has some very relevant questions. So I want to just address what I was going to say quickly, and then I'm going to shift.
Okay.
So your article about people's gut response, man, it blew me away. As a woman, I've been trained, like, listen to your gut, and also as a human too, right? But it's acceptable for me to say, well, I just have a feeling. And in fact, I was just watching a television program about U.S. government. It was a docudrama. It wasn't real life. And the woman is a powerful leader in the government, and the president says to her, how do you know? And she says, well, I just have a feeling. Yeah. And and it's acceptable. But with that said, also in policy and when it comes to war and stuff, things like gut feelings are acceptable. But with that context, I come back to your thing about all these men saying, I just have a gut feeling that she's no good, right, about Hillary. Yeah. And you're saying, well, that's actually systemic sexism. That blew my mind away, because it's such a different way of looking at what is a gut feeling. And I will thank you. Now you've caused me to challenge my own gut feeling, and not because of a gendered issue, but from where does a gut feeling? So can we just spend a couple of minutes and talking about, has men develop a greater relationship with their gut feelings? What's that mean?
Yeah, I think it hits upon why institutional racism and institutional sexism, why these are such difficult problems to eradicate. Because I think on the one hand, it's very part of how we are built as humans is to make very quick decisions. We can't always make decisions based on perfect factual information. There's just too much coming in. So like Malcolm Gladwell writes about in Blink, like that gut feeling, that very quick decision that you make when you meet someone or when you confront an issue, in microseconds. And that's based on, your experience with things, and also what you see in the media, and who you've talked to and how things are packaged. And I think that on the one hand, it's a very important ability that humans have to make those decisions. You have to do that. But at the same time, I think if we don't unpack and examine those feelings, and if we're not willing to do that, it can be very, very very impacted by what we see in the media and how things are represented. And I think, with that article that you mentioned, I thought what I found was it's the same exact thing that you see in racism and sexism. And I told you I got started at the Goodman Project writing about sports, and that's actually how I came into this issue. There's this very publicized issue about Colin Kaepernick, who was the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, who, as a Black Lives Matter protest, didn't stand for the national anthem. He kneeled, and there's just and he is still unemployed. He's probably not going to be employed again. There's a very powerful response that was wrong, and people, just not examining that response is racist. And I believe it's racist because he's silently exercising a First Amendment right, and that's the nature of protest. He's not disturbing anyone, but people react to it so powerfully. And I saw that same sort of gut response with Hillary. In many ways, she's not. We're not used to seeing a powerful woman, speaking confidently with mastery of the issues, and there's a lot. We've all heard the critique of her being, shrill or bossy, or that's sort of common across the executive suite. And I'm not saying that you necessarily didn't vote for Hillary because you're a sexist, but that's certainly part of it if you look at it. Because I think the statistics and sort of the timing of things that I referred to in the article, made it pretty clear that a lot of that gut reaction, we've never had a woman president, and we're not used to seeing women in that point of view. And I got a lot of negative reaction to that article. Right? Not everyone these are not conversations where everyone's like, oh, I completely agree, I'm sexist. It's a really hard thing to examine. My brother completely came after me on Facebook, and he likes to poke fun at me because he calls me a feminist, and he's different politically than I am, and he likes to tease me about it. But he said, I just didn't like her. And I said, okay, but would you examine kind of why that is? And he was like, no, I don't have to. So yeah.
Well, that's that statement. That's a very interesting question and statement. Which I'm going to go back to this other question in a minute. But I want it's him not wanting to look at it is also an indicative of male privilege. If you said that to a woman, and also so many women, we always our social upbringing is, oh, where's my fault? What did I do wrong? Right. It's so interesting, the multiple layers of it. I'm cautious here because I'm going to switch now topics to somebody's question here. He's got a very complex story his name is, and please, my Spanish is not my strong language. So Gerardo Hernandez from Mexico City is typing in.
Okay.
He's got a very complex story here, in which there's a history of domestic violence and abuse and multiple families coming together. And he's talking about his pain that he's in. It's a little bit long of a story, and I don't want to share all the details right now. But he's saying he wants to change things in the world, and he's on the edge, and his heart is really in pain. And he says his attention has been brought to the nonviolent communication works of Marshall Rosenberg. And he says, I'm on an edge and not sure of he's wanting the way of peace and not sure how to go. And so he says, do you think it's feasible to have a Good Men's Project branch in Mexico City? So that's one thing, which maybe that piece we can address a little bit further offline, or maybe you can touch on it. But how does a man, what kind of tools are out there for a man who wants to be of service and wants to help and wants to change?
Yeah, I mean, they're a great question, and I'm sorry to hear that story. It's difficult. It's difficult to go through, and I think it's hard to understand and deal with. So I thank you for sharing it and for that question. I'm not familiar with the work of Marshall Rosenberg specifically, but look, domestic violence and violence in general, and I've what I can say is that there are huge communities of people that have gone through what you've gone through. And asking that question, I think, is a great step to connecting to those communities. For example, I'll give you an example. Again, it's funny that it came through sports, but so I live in New Jersey, and there's a high school football team there a couple years ago that had won the state championship for 5 straight years, very macho, strong culture. And it came out that there was, man on man, sexual abuse going on in the form of hazing in a locker room, and that the coaches turned a blind eye to it. And this happened, a few towns away from where I live. And I wrote about it for the Good Men Project, and I sort of examined, that type of sexual violence and how it's the power dynamic and why it happens. And through that, a lot of people reached out to me, and I had just written about it. I just I hadn't experienced it as a person, and I had people. It got picked up by the BBC and by Salon, and it really made me realize that there's a way into these issues, like using the sports platform, which was interesting, which I hadn't really thought about. But a lot of people reach out to me with their personal stories of sexual violence or just violence, and someone wrote to me from Australia, and she said, "Oh, are you going to this conference on men who have suffered from violence?" It's called the Male Survivor Conference, and she said, I'm in Australia. I come to that conference every year, and it would happen to be like 3 towns over from where I lived. And I went to that conference, and I sat with those 500 men. It's an amazing community. And in terms of how to be of service, I'd say as a first step, just try to connect to those people. And some, people have different talents, and I don't know you, but one way that one thing I think I can do. I'm a terrible artist in terms of painting, but I think I can write, and so I enjoy writing. But there's so many different ways to do good. But I think the first step is to connect. And to do that, you have to be brave enough to share and to find other people. But I think, like my story with mental health or any of these, I think that these communities are there, and it's just a question of uncovering them. And I think once you do, I think you'll find a very rich, not only support network, but a network of people who want to change, passionate about that issue. And I think together we can do a lot of good if we're brave enough to find each other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very powerful. I'm just sort of sitting with this for a little bit because it's a very hard topic. And having spent recently a little bit of time in Mexico City. The violence against women is horrific, and it's that way in many places over the world. But just because he's from Mexico, I'm sort of touching in on that, and I had the good fortune of being with a community of people that were really working towards societal change while there, and we got into a conversation of how much harm. How much pain the men are in who are also inflicting the violence on the women. And, so much of how we look at rape and violence towards women is, she should dress differently and she should hold the keys in her hand. It's all about how she's supposed to protect herself from this wild beast. Well, what the heck is that? I mean, seriously?
Yeah.
Hey, disempowering to the men? and
yeah.
also giving them permission to own their anger. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off,
No, no,
but
no, I was trying to cut you off.
uh,
No, I think that's a great point, and you know, uh, like I talked about American culture, and I know that it might be a generalization, but I know in terms of like, you know, machismo and being strong, I think and you know, in Mexican culture, it might even be a more difficult to be, you know, but you know, we've wrote a lot about you know, rape culture and abuse of all types. You know, like with the Stanford swimmer case, and we see it in our culture kind of repeated and repeated. Um, and and the problem is it's not a quick fix. Like you said, it's, you know, this is, you know, just like racism, it's passed on generation to generation through a million tiny little ways. And you know, the whole boys will be boys, ha ha ha. I think is responsible for so much harm. I think it does such a big disservice to boys, you know, and to men, and obviously, you know, to women in the world, to say, oh, you know, that's just boys being boys. That, you know, no, like, you know, we're humans. We're not just, you know, bags of hormones that don't exhibit restraint when we go out into the world and deal with other humans. And so I think that, you know, creates a lot of problems and a lot of privilege. But no, I think you're right to sit with that question, because it speaks to there are a lot of obstacles, and I think you start off in an abusive situation that takes you know, that can take so much away from you, um, in terms of, you know, energy and self-worth, and just trying to comprehend what's happening, and that in and of itself is such an isolating experience, that I think it takes tremendous bravery to come forward. But I think once you do, like I said, and you can find other people.
sorry about that. Whoops. Uh-oh.
For the person who asked the question.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. Sorry about that. My computer sort of froze up for half a
That's
second.
okay.
Yeah. Hold on one second. There's a comment. Oh, okay. This has got a little bit of continuation of this with just a moment, an expression of gratitude from Sandy Hart, who's the director of the Women and Girls sector of Charter for Compassion. And she says, as an international organization of Charter for Compassion International, the conversation of machismo and other culturally deep-rooted beliefs of the role of men and women require a rebalancing of the divine masculine and divine feminine. We must continue this conversation. Thank you, Gerardo. Okay, so yeah, just wanted to put that out there, and it is, you know, so going back to the process that men are going through or getting to go through, do you experience a collective sigh of relief also in being able to take responsibility for their actions, well, their actions. I don't want to put it all again. I don't want to reverse it either, too, where suddenly it's all on the men. But when you talk to men about this, what's the feedback? Is there a willingness to take responsibility? What do you see?
It's interesting. So I don't know if I mentioned, but so I'm director of special projects at the Good Men Project, and that's a title that we created, so I can basically do whatever I want, which is great. But the special projects that we've been working on mostly have been this set of what we call social interest groups, and they're communities that orient around a particular issue. And we have calls every week, and we have about 10 of these groups, and so we have multiple calls every day, and we have little Facebook groups where we can talk in between the calls. But one of the calls that we have is the Stop Sexism group, and it's men and women who talk about, you know, we talk about it through the prism of, you know, the week's news, but also how do we collaborate together to actually do change? And so we'll do projects together. So having that conversation is amazing and difficult. And, you know, the other day we had someone come onto the call for the first time, who I know, who's very smart and caring guy. And he's an older gentleman. I think he's, you know, in his 60s or 70s. And someone said, you know, old white guy in a critical way, and he took great offense to that. And he said, well, this is offensive and I'm a man. And people on the call were saying, well, it's not about you as a man. This is it's about, the women should be, centered in this issue. And so that illustrates, and our leaders are great. But it is a difficult conversation. But we've had conversations, I can say, that actually talking to each other as humans in this setting, it's interesting because we have Facebook groups. And so sometimes people get snarky and snippy sometimes. Most times people get snarky and snippy in the Facebook groups, but then those same people come to the call. And I've seen this in our Stop Racism group. A very, smart, educated, Black man who's very, very progressive in terms of, and fierce in terms of fighting racism. And, a white guy from Texas who's pushing back. But I've seen those people talk to each other. And actually come to common understandings. And I think part of what we're seeing is we don't talk enough. So yes, it's satisfying to give people a forum for that, and we're trying to grow it. And we feel like we're growing it like person by person. We're like, how do we scale this? How do we bring like thousands of people? And it's so hard. And I think it's so tempting to be like, oh, we'll just type something on Facebook, but it just doesn't work. It doesn't work when you're not actually talking to each other for some reason, and how it can get, online. It just seems, people just stick to their guns. But I think it goes back to storytelling, because when you're talking to a real person who's saying like, no, listen to me. This happened to me last week. This is not acceptable. And I'm not saying all men are evil. I'm saying this happened to me last week. How can we educate children to do this better? How can we work with boys and teenagers that they understand these issues? What can you do, right, as a man, right? We have the whole like Trump like locker room talk, right? There are things that men who want to be allies, who want to change the world, can do. And one of those things is not standing by and laughing at damaging behavior. It's being man enough to take a guy aside and say, dude, that's not cool. It's not funny. We don't do that. And so I think we're trying to give people the tools to do that. And it's satisfying that, and I'm excited about it. But I wish there were a way to do it bigger, faster, better. But it may just be that we have to do it person by person. And so
you guys, now you've raised an interesting question. So, when Trump came out with his, grab 'em statement, I went and I asked a lot of my male friends, like, is this your reality? And most men that I had said no. So I have to ask you, as a man who's deeply embedded in supporting men's awareness and men's growth, did you hear something differently than I'd heard as a woman? Did you hear people say, like, laughing and joking with it? And is that part of the reality that you experience working with men?
Yeah, no, that was not my reality. And I played sports. I played basketball. I was never in a locker room where men are talking about an act that would be considered rape or sexual abuse. I mean, yes, like men are sexual beings and women are sexual beings, and you might talk about, someone and, say something off color, right? Like, oh, like I'd love to hit that or whatever, you might say something like that, that you might, that might be locker room talk. But, there's a big difference between saying like, I'm attracted to someone, and saying, oh, I'm going to rape that person, which is really what he said, no matter what we call it. So that's not something that I experienced. And that's another, example of, and so that got swept under as, oh, that's just boys being boys. That's locker room talk. And that's not fair to men, because it's not, maybe, so maybe there are some men that act in that way, but those are bad humans. And so, to say boys will be boys and that's acceptable, and it's not acceptable. And I think that it's our responsibility to be more vocal about that and to be more active about it, because that's our obligation. There is a reality that if you're sitting in a room with 5 women, at least 1 or 2, I'm not sure the exact numbers, have been sexually abused, and so that's happening, and it's not because of women. So I think we have to take an active role, and that doesn't mean that we're fatally flawed or evil, but it means that as a good human being, we have to acknowledge that reality and try and change it. And that's a conversation about men, right? It's a conversation about changing men, whether it's yourself or how you educate or how you speak or what you do, how you act, what you model.
Right, and it really does go back to the systemic thinking, and also, your comment about the white old guy, that comment of, not wanting to personalize it. We have to be able to talk about the subject, the systemic system, and then how the individual plays in the system, and recognize the power that an individual can also have in shifting the system, and that it starts, to your point about Facebook, one little person at a time.
Yeah. I want to touch, on the systemic versus personal. I think it's a really important point, because it's really hard, and I've certainly done it on Facebook and been like, that's just racist. Like, it's really hard. If you really want to change someone, you're not going to do it by calling them names. And I understand there is sometimes a need to call out bad behavior and to say, no, this is not acceptable. And I do that sometimes. But I think we really have to talk to each other, and I think when people talk about feminism and men talking about feminism, that's a very big tent, right? And lots of people have different views about what feminism means, and what a man's role is in that, as an ally, and I do think it is dangerous, and I see some people, very aggressively say, can come off as being anti-man, and I understand that. I understand why, but I don't find it to be productive. I think sometimes, like I said, based on the numbers, like, it's justified, and sometimes men can say stupid things and often do stupid things. But I think if we're trying to work together, it's really hard to say to someone, and I think that's how Mr. White Old Guy felt, that because you're a man, you don't get a voice, and I don't have to listen to you, and what you care about isn't relevant. I think we have to keep in mind, like, when we're talking about sexism, there's an institutional aspect to it, and there's a personal aspect to it, and it is a men's problem. That can be hard for men to hear, but I think there's a difference between that and saying, but anything you say is valueless because you're just a man. I think that's because, like I said, the man box negatively affects men too, and that's how we're trying to sort of push social change. Like, yes, I hope that you're caring enough and a good enough person to do this because it's the right thing and you shouldn't treat people this way. But also, like, even if you're totally selfish and you only care about yourself, like, okay, let's look at it from that way. Are you really helping yourself? Look, you're damaging yourself in these ways. So that's how we're trying to do it anyway.
That's also requires a holistic perspective of self-awareness too, because the ramifications are, huge. Touch your feelings and be aware of certain parts of your life.
Yeah, no, for sure. And this past year, for sure, I think I've come to the realization that people are less self-aware and potentially more crazy than I've ever really understood them to be before. So it's a challenge.
Well, that's actually was the motivation for this series, right? Because we want to help people shift from, like, reacting from fear and, like, oh my God, what's going on, to, like, okay, wow, there's a huge gap. And there's a huge difference between people's mentality. There are gender issues, there are race issues, there's so many issues, and we need to wake up and start working much more collectively. One of the questions that came in, and I'm aware of time, so we have about 6 minutes left. So before I get to anybody else's question, is there anything in particular you feel like you want to share with us in this format?
Nothing comes to mind. We can just come at it organically. If you want to ask the question, and then we can just keep talking. That's fine.
Very good. She asks, what are the roles that women may be guilty of perpetuating such an imbalance of masculine and feminine qualities, and or preventing men from realizing and embracing more of their feminine qualities?
That's a great question. And I think, you know, when I say that society has a very strong policing of the man box that sort of enforce this view of traditional masculinity that I think can sometimes be toxic. It's not just men, you know, it's women too. And I'm reminded so I think a lot of women play a very big role in sort of enforcing those same sort of sexist norms. I read an article in the Times after the election that talked to a lot of women Trump voters, of which there were many. And it was interesting. You know, they asked about the misogyny and, you know, his statements that we were talking about before, the locker room stuff. And, you know, there were so many of them. It was really disheartening to read because woman after woman were saying, oh, well, that's just like, you know, my ex-husband was just that way. He's just being a guy.
Right.
So I think, you know, accepting and excusing that is a triggering, is a behavior. And I think also just having low expectations of men or sort of gendered expectations of men, you know, by women, I think, you know, doesn't view, you know, the man as a whole and can harm the women. So if you just, you know, if some 12-year-old kid, you know, pinches some girl's ass in class and doesn't understand consent, and you say, oh, you know, I mean, this is a real story, right? Go to the principal's office with the parents, and the principal says, oh, that's just because he likes her. You know, that's and you know, both men and women can perpetuate those qualities and those norms. And it's interesting. I mean, for me, I mean, I came to the Good Men Project, you know, just like 3 or 4 years ago, but I consider, and, you know, I played sports and I like sports, and so I think, like, in a lot of ways, like, I'm traditionally male, you know, but I think a lot of the qualities that are some of my best qualities are qualities that would be considered to be feminine, right? Like listening and like the touchy feely stuff. Like I don't know. And so it's hard to, you know, it made me realize that drawing strict lines, you know, it works both ways, and can be harmful both ways. But it's confusing. I think the next generation, like our kids, you know, what I see now going on with the LGBTQ community and sexuality, like they're going to be leaps and bounds, you know, in terms of defining what it really means to be masculine and feminine and how that goes. I think it's going to be an interesting future too.
Absolutely. Well, we have 2 minutes left, and you just did touch on one last question that I wanted to ask you about, was raising children, and you just touched on it with what's the world we're creating for the future. And you have a son and a daughter, if I caught it correctly.
Yeah.
How is it to raise them, and how does this gender issue of creating holistic humans touch into this versus the systemic male-female norms?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun because my kids are kind of interested in my writing, and so I get to talk to them about the Good Men Project, and I'm very open in talking to them about the news. And, you know, with my son, sometimes I come at it through sports, but I've been very open and transparent in talking about these issues and using current events as teaching moments. I think maybe even more so than my parents were with me. I think they were like, this isn't appropriate. I'm going to shield kids from this. But they're actually really thoughtful and capable little humans. And I think, you know, for all parents, you know, there's no playbook, and we're all just kind of trying to do the best we can. And I think the way that I've done that is by, you know, just being open and listening to them and trying to, you know, promote these values. I think, you know, I read that kids are more influenced by what they see you doing and thinking about than by what you tell them. So, which I think goes to the power of storytelling again. So, you know, you try and model those good behaviors, and you're really open, and then you hope for the best.
Right on. Right on. All right. Well, I think we'll wrap it up here. And
Sure.
I just want to thank you so much, Michael, for your time. And I look forward to you joining us and everyone else who may be participating to the after party, which the URL is in the chat section if you didn't write it down at the beginning of the call. And thank you. And we look forward to seeing everyone else on our next call, which is we're moving into July, and we're speaking actually. Well, originally it was about giving women voice. It's also relevant to men, which is how do we find our voice? And we're going to be speaking in July. We have 2 speakers, as we do every month. The first one, and I'm not going to go into all the details now, so you can go check out the website. But we are going to be talking about public speaking and getting your voice out, and then also blog writing and getting your word out through the written word as well. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you everyone else, and we'll see you later. Be well. Lots of love, lots of compassion. Bye.